Hello, my name is Michael Csoka, and today I will be discussing my homeostasis project, the respiratory system, and the effect tuberculosis has on it. First, I'll start off with the structure. So this picture, which can be found at your textbook in the respiratory chapter, chapter 22, the respiratory system consists of, starting from the top, going to the bottom of this image. This is just a rough overview, not zooming in on certain parts, but this is just basically enough that you'll need to know. The nasal cavity, the nostril, the oral cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, trachea, right and left main bronchi, or bronchus if it's by itself, the right and left lungs, and the diaphragm. As I stated earlier, it can be broken down into smaller areas, mainly the upper airway, the trachea area, and the respiratory zone, which is the lungs. So will get into more of the function and homeostasis, of course, later. But a brief overview is that the nasal cavity and the oral cavity are used to draw in air. They are air pathways, which then go through. This is a rough overview, by the way. Go through the trachea into the bronchus or the bronchi, um, and then into the lungs, and then from there, the rest of what I'll get into later happens, which is the main part of respiration. Now, let's move on to function. So, the function of this organ system is to be able to bring oxygen into the body so that blood can transport it throughout to different cells around the body for use in cellular respiration. Also, the respiratory system expunges carbon dioxide that the cells generate during cellular respiration. Now, another third thing that is used mainly for is that when expunging CO2 from your lungs, you also pass through the vocal cord, which is in where the larynx is. And because you're passing gas through it, humanity and animals really have developed a way to making the vocal cords, which will allow you to speak because the air will stimulate the different vocal cords into producing noise. Now, moving on to how homeostasis and how this respiratory system affects homeostasis. The respiratory system works to maintain homeostasis mainly through the process called gas exchange. Gas exchange is the basically gas diffusion throughout different areas in life and chemistry and stuff, but for what we want to worry about is in the lungs. Gas is brought into this area and diffuses into alveolar sac or alveolar sacs, sorry, which then is dissolved into blood and is carried away, and also CO2 is diffused out of the blood into the lungs and then expunged from the main airways. And this alveolar sacs, these are the main parts of the respiratory system. The most important parts is what I would say, because blood comes through this area, and the gas diffusion that happens there is the oxygen is put in, being dissolved into the blood, and then CO2 diffuses out of the blood that blood had brought in from passing by nearby cells, and then that CO2 is released, more oxygen is brought in, and the cycle continues indefinitely for your entire life, and it only stops when the person is but dead, very much really, because this is a automatic process. You don't need to have to control it very much. It should be automatic, though of course some mental, like, if something gets messed up mentally, that can change. But without further ado, let's move on to how TB affects homeostasis. Tuberculosis, or TB, as I previously stated, is a bacterial infection, which on the picture on the right is what tuberculosis looks like on a, of course, microscopic level. So Tuberculosis is caused by the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria infecting a part of the lungs. And I will state that other parts of the body can be infected by tuberculosis. Mainly it's the lungs, but parts around it can also be affected, but that is in smaller cases. Now, tuberculosis infection happens when you breathe in the bacteria from the air. It's an airborne disease that is spread by a tuberculosis infected person coughing up the bacteria that had been created in their lungs, coughing up more of it out into the air. Someone else breathes it in, and then if they don't have a good enough immune system, it infects them. Then, once the infection begins, and if your immune system is not capable of fighting it off, the tuberculosis bacteria will start attacking different lung tissue and destroying it if your immune system cannot fight it off. This destruction of the tissue is widespread. It's not very poignant towards a specific part. They're just destroying and eating your body just to survive themselves. Now, this affects homeostasis because this means that the bacteria can destroy the alveolar sacs, which will, of course, interrupt the amount of oxygen your blood can absorb and the amount of CO2 your blood can release, because that process won't be able to happen if those sacs are getting destroyed or are completely destroyed. Now, tuberculosis particularly starts usually with a cough, very mild for a start, but then chest pains start to appear and a badder cough your cough starts to worsen. And of course, more symptoms relating to coughing up blood or mucus and such, or like painful chest pains. And eventually, if it is left untreated, it leads to death. Now, treatment is just with antibiotics, since it is a bacteria, which of course, like many other bacteria infections in the modern age, have started to mutate to become resistant to antibiotics. But that is another issue. Now I will move on to the final part of my presentation, which is the demographics, particularly how the US compares to other countries, and mostly where it is in the world and stuff that has happened in modern age with tuberculosis. So, tuberculosis is pretty much everywhere. It's hard to find a country that doesn't have a case unless it's severely isolated or has very good health care. Now, the US in 2020 only reported 7,174 cases, which is very small, but it still exists. Now, you might be wondering how tuberculosis exists in this modern age. Well, in Western nations, starting in the 1980s, HIV/AIDS started to begin spreading around due to it was just an epidemic that happened at the time, and this meant that tuberculosis rates also started to rise because HIV is an immunosuppression disease, and when your immune system gets weakened, then infection in all cases will start to be able to rise, and in this case, tuberculosis infection. Now, heading back to the US, the US reported these small amount of cases. US is one of the lowest countries with tuberculosis rates. In Asia, pretty much the whole continent, mostly India and China, but they hold a lot of the population in Asia anyway, have high tuberculosis rates. So 8 countries contributed to having 86% of the 2020 tuberculosis cases. These included, starting from the most prevalent tuberculosis to the least prevalent, India, China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and South Africa. Most of these countries on this list were from Asia, and a lot of people in them are affected by tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis does have a vaccine that has begun spreading. In the US, though, we don't use it because we have good health care, so tuberculosis isn't too much of a worry on people's minds, apart from in the early 2000s when the risk of a a massive epidemic. Currently, you could attribute it to the scare that had happened. What would be that the pandemic now is. So imagine like how people act in the early 2000s about tuberculosis in the United States, how like the current pandemic is now. Like they thought that was what's going to happen. Though, of course, it didn't. But anyway, that's a little tangent. But tuberculosis vaccine has been made and is usually in countries with poor health care, particularly Africa or like really rural Asian nations. So that way, if they don't have access to antibiotics, they at least have some way to try and curtail the spread of tuberculosis. Apart from that, that is everything in my presentation to go over. I hope you found this interesting. Tuberculosis is a very interesting disease because, in my opinion, I always find it to be an archaic thing. Like this is something from the 1800s that cowboys died of, but it's still prevalent very much today and still affects a lot of people. So, thank you for watching this. My name is Michael Csoka. I'll see you later.